Hello, America, and to our friends around the world, greetings and welcome back to What Everybody is Saying, an FBI Agent's Guide to Speed Reading People by Joe Navarro. We're on Chapter 2, The Flight Response. One purpose of the freeze response is to avoid detection by dangerous predators or in dangerous situations. A second purpose is to give the threatened individual the opportunity to assess the situation and determine the best course of action to take. When the freeze response is not adequate to eliminate the danger or is not the best course of action, for example, the threat is too close, the second limbic response is to get away by use of the flight response. Obviously, the goal of this choice is to escape the threat or, at a minimum, to distance oneself from danger. Running, of course, is useful when it is practical, and as a survival mechanism, our brain directed our body to adopt this tactic judiciously over millennia in order to escape from danger. In our modern world, however, where we live in cities and not in the wild, it is difficult to run from threats. Therefore, we have adapted the flight response to meet our modern needs. The behaviors are not as obvious, but they serve the same purpose to either block or distance ourselves from the physical presence of undesirable individuals or things. When I talked about this, I believe in chapter 1, in regards to when you're approaching somebody, especially a man walking towards a woman and a woman approaching a man down a corridor, hallway, and how she turns her eyes will be a signal as to whether it's a sign of submission, looking down in a way, or an aversion by just turning laterally away from, laterally meaning that there's, the head stays, the eyes stay fixed upon the direction they're going at that elevation, but then they just turn ahead away from the oncoming object, or in this case, person. All right, so let's see. We have adapted the flight response to meet our modern needs. The behaviors are not as obvious, but they serve the same purpose to either block or distance ourselves from the physical presence of undesirable individuals or things. If you think back on the social interactions you've had in your life, you'll probably be able to recall some of the evasive actions you took to distance yourself from the unwanted attention of others. Just as a child turns away from undesirable food at the dinner table and shifts her feet toward the exit. This is the most critical signal. I'm going to repeat that and then I'm going to go into it a little more. And shifts her feet toward the exit. Where are your feet in relationship to the decision making faculties of who you are? If your answer was something along the lines of they are at the opposite end or the most extreme end, the furthest away from, excellent. And nothing against anybody who didn't come up with that answer. There might be other reasons why you came up with a different answer. But that is the answer that I'm going for, is that in a thought process, in a response, the feet are the furthest from the brain, which means they're the least likely to be considered in incorporating, for lack of a better word, deception. I've used this in other videos as a demonstration, and that is the feet don't lie. And what was it? That artist Shakira, the hips don't lie. It's kind of the same idea, and that the feet, even more so, are going to be pointed in the direction of what it is that they intend. When you're having an interaction with another individual, if both feet aren't planted pointing at you, there is some other factor that is influencing them to want to exit. And it could be anything from deception to avoidance to a prior commitment that they do not want to disrespect. The feet being pointed away from you demonstrates that you have lower value than what potentially has higher value for that individual. That is the black and white of it. That's all there is to it. The feet are the furthest away from the brain, ergo, they are the least influenced by the neocortex, prefrontal cortex, and they will provide the most tell as to an individual's intention. This goes back to the behavioral table of elements, ankle locking. This goes back to having the person who is very firm in their stance, where they place their feet about shoulder widths apart, and both, the feet are pointed in the same direction, making them a more stable, more grounded opponent. If you think back on the interactions you've had in your life, you'll probably be able to recall some of the evasive actions you took to distance yourself. All right, we've got that. So just as a child turns away from undesirable food at the dinner table and shifts her feet toward the exit, an individual may turn away from someone she doesn't like or to avoid conversations that threaten her. Blocking behaviors may manifest in the form of closing the eyes, rubbing the eyes, or placing the hands in front of the face. Right now in our society, we are facing a very, very malignant outcome of the Me Too movement, the Believe All Women movement, the feminist movement, and that is women being accused of a crime and covering their face to cry. A lot of you are going to know right off the bat, women use crying as a defense mechanism to get out of responsibility. You can be insulted all you want, you can make your accusations all you want, but the fact remains, it is a defensive tactic that is used to keep from being held accountable for criminal and evil actions. You can watch any number of videos of these teachers being arrested and covering their face, hoping that the arresting officer or the judge, whomever, will take pity upon them because it has worked in the past. And again, to emphasize it, I'm going to go into social engineering as we develop these skills so that you can better understand how this stuff works so you can see it in real time. I mean, right now we're living in the best point in time where so many videos exist of real people being caught and exhibiting all these neon signals of deception, of you know all of these examples of shamed behavior or surprised or happy. The The person may also distance herself from someone by leaning away, placing objects, a purse, on her lap, or turning her feet toward the nearest exit. All of these behaviors are controlled by the limbic brain and indicate that someone wants distance from one or more undesirable persons or any perceived threat in the environment. Again, we undertake these behaviors because for millions of years, humans have withdrawn from things we didn't like or that could harm us. Therefore, to this day, we expedite our exit from a deplorable party, distance ourselves from a bad relationship, or lean away from those who are deemed undesirable or even with whom we strongly disagree. Just as a man may turn away from his date, an individual in negotiations may shift away from his counterpart if he hears an unattractive offer or feels threatened as bargaining continues. Remember the example he gave that Mr. Navarro gave in an earlier video about the negotiation he sat in on? Blocking behaviors may also be manifested. The business person may close or rub his eyes or place his hands in front of his face. Before I continue, this is the lean away. This is figure 5. People lean away from each other subconsciously when they disagree or feel uncomfortable around each other. This might be, on the surface, exaggerated, but it's through exaggeration, and you'll find this in animation in particular, that we we identify it, and then we can see it once we begin to recognize, wait a minute, these artists are drawing upon real life situations, and yes, it might be an exaggeration, but when you start to learn to associate, for example, the behavioral table of elements by Chase Hughes, where you're able to take those DRS rating numbers and calculate what it represents, you're going to get a better sense as to what's going on around you. And you're going to be able to do that calculation in intuitively, when it happens. And here we have the next example, and that's eye blocking. It's a, it reads, it is a very powerful display of consternation, disbelief, or disagreement. You cover your eyes, you close your eyes to something you don't want. That's the most elemental aspect that I can convey to you. You close your eyes to block off what is being presented before you. And that is unfortunately what happened to Daniel Pearson with Angela Buramova. She was repulsed by him and his existence, and her bigotry cost him his freedom. Which, I'm not the one who called for it. Other people called for it, and that is declaring March. I mean, we have a Mother's Day, we have a President's Day, we have a Father's Day. I mean, heck, we even have for a significant number of the American people, Christmas Day, relegated to whom it is that they worship. But we give an entire month to women who demographically are the largest mass murdering genocidal group on the planet for the last 60 some years, and who are believe all women. abuse their power, in this case, to wrongfully persecute somebody. This is the modern day Salem witch trials. These women running around making false allegations and not receiving any penalty. It has to end. And I can speak for myself. I don't give a flying fig if it ends or not. I've already demonstrated I can survive in the wilderness without you and without society. It's hard. I'm not going to lie, but I was able to do it. The question is, can you? Because it is you who has no recourse if you can't. If you can't survive on your own in the wilderness to avoid this nonsense, if you're not properly trained or skilled, there's a, what was it, Hank Williams Jr., A Country Boy Will Survive. I mean, how many of you know that if you need to jumpstart a car, you just take another car's battery and connect it, just take it. You don't even need cables. You just take it and flip it upside down and match it to the lead studs, the appropriate, positive to positive. How many of you know to do that? How many of you know that you can even pull the dead battery out and reconnect the cables to a good battery, start it, remove the good battery, and put the dead one back in to let the alternator charge it? How many of you know that you can start a fire with steel wool pressed against the end of a 9-volt battery, or for that matter, any battery that have the ability to connect to the positive and negative end? What I'm trying to illustrate is these skills are acquirable. If I'm capable of learning them and using them to survive in the wilderness with limited supplies, you also have that potential. Your forefathers, your ancestors did that, as remarked earlier in chapter 2, on the savannah, to avoid predators, whether it's other hominids, humans, whatever you want to call them, or other animals that had more ferocity, more lethal skills. I just saw on X last night. Somebody had a picture or a video of a 9 foot tall kangaroo. I mean, we don't have problems with kangaroos in North America, but you're not going to go head to head with a moose or an antelope, probably not even a deer. The antlers on any one of them is enough to butcher somebody, not to mention the ferocious strength they would have. And unless you know how to hunt them and track them, you're not going to be able to eat. Unless you know how to make the weapons to take them down without injuring yourself, you're not only going to starve to death, you're going to starve to death immobile because of injury. And that's what I'm attempting to prevent here. This is what I'm attempting to provide is the tools to recognize how to operate both in and out of society. All right, so that was figure 6 with the eye blocking. He may lean away and then the lean away. He may lean away from the table or the other person and turn his feet away as well, sometimes in the direction of the nearest exit. These are not behaviors of deception, but rather actions that signal that a person feels uncomfortable. These forms of the age old flight response are distancing nonverbal behaviors that tell you the business person is unhappy with what is occurring at the table. All right, the next topic of this chapter is the flight response, the 3 F's. We've dealt with freeze, we've just completed flight, and now we're going to deal with confrontation. You're backed against the wall, or You're protecting what's yours. Right now, we have a flurry of individuals who are vandalizing automobiles because of their political ideology. And these people that are the victims are standing their ground and using the security sentry surveillance system to identify these individuals and prosecute. I just heard a story that at least one individual is suing the vandalizer, the felon, for civilly for $1 million. That is a fight response. Both of them, the vandalism action and then the retaliatory legal action, are both a fight response. The fight response is the limbic brain's final tactic for survival through aggression. When a person confronting danger cannot avoid detection by freezing and cannot save himself by distancing or escaping flight, the only alternative left is to fight. In our evolution as a species, we, along with other mammals, developed the strategy of turning fear into rage in order to fight off attackers. Paxip, 1998, page 208. In the modern world, however, our acting on our rage may not be practical or even legal. So the limbic brain has developed other strategies beyond the more primitive physical fight response. One form of modern aggression is an argument, although the original meaning of the term argument relates simply to a debate or discussion. The word is increasingly used to describe a verbal altercation. And again, I want to draw attention to what I said earlier in this chapter. I said the same thing using the examples of Andrew Wilson or Alex Jones, describing these things as an information war, a war of ideas. The word is increasingly used to describe a verbal altercation. An overheated argument is essentially fighting by non physical means. The use of insults, ad hominem phrases, counter allegations, denigration of professional stature, goading, and sarcasm are all, in their own ways, the modern equivalent of fighting because they are all forms of aggression. And to emphasize, because most people think of this as a negative, Alex Jones, if he wasn't the first, he was probably the most vocal about atrazine. He did his. You can probably find it online somewhere, but the 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 raging. I'm tired of them putting chemicals in the water, making turning the frogs gay. That if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching. But what he's describing is a chemical called atrazine, and if you look into what atrazine does, it turns frogs hermaphroditic. He was being, he was being exaggerating it, but at the same time, he was drawing attention to the reality of what this chemical is doing to frogs. What is it doing to us? So, even though the negative focuses on ad hominem phrases, denigration, sarcasm, arguing is also the ability to take and use facts, to use documents, and maybe to exaggerate them to leave an emotional impression on someone, but at their core, to be accurate. The modern equivalent of fighting, because they are all forms of aggression. If you think about it, civil lawsuits can even be construed as a modern and socially sanctioned type of fight or aggression in which litigants aggressively argue two opposing viewpoints. While humans probably engage in physical altercations far less now than in other periods in our history, Fighting is still a part of our limbic armory. Although some people are more prone to violence than others, our limbic response shows up in many ways other than punching, kicking, and biting. You can be very aggressive without physical contact. For example, just by using your posture, your eyes, by puffing out your chest, or by violating another's personal space. Threats to our personal space elicit a limbic response on an individual level. In fact, you can find when you start mastering body language and neuro-linguistic programming, you can essentially social engineer people to provoke them. You can provoke them into being the aggressor. There are tactics that are very easily learned in which you can manipulate somebody and make yourself the victim and them the aggressor. And we see that, and as time goes by, as more of these readings continue, you're going to be able to integrate that into your own set of tools to identify, and you're going to recognize it at first as an outside observer, and then the more critical part is that you're going to be able to have these tools at your ready to recognize when you are in real time being manipulated and being set up. Once these things become, once you get used to them, once you start using them, you check yourself on becoming arrogant, but do recognize what's going on when it's happening. And you can save yourself a lot of time, a lot of hurt, a lot of money sometimes. Interesting, these territorial violations can also create limbic responses on a collective level. We're seeing that with the protests currently against a car, a specific car. When one country intrudes into the space of another, it often results in economic sanctions, severing of diplomatic relations, or even wars. So on the local level, you see these violent protesters, vandalizing a certain brand of car and their dealerships, and even escalating to physical violence. And this is resulting in severe criminal penalty. But then, in a collective level, yes, a collective level is the failure of diplomacy on a national, international level. Obviously, it is easy to recognize when someone uses the fight response to commit a physical assault. What I want to identify for you are the not so obvious ways in which individuals exhibit some of the more subtle behaviors associated with the fight response. Just as we have seen modified expressions of the freeze and flight limbic reactions, modern decorum dictates that we refrain from acting on our primitive inclinations to fight when threatened. In general, I advise people to refrain from using aggression, verbal or physical, as a means of achieving their objectives. Just as the fight response is the act of last resort in dealing with a threat, used only after the freeze and flight tactics have proven unworkable, so too should you avoid it whenever feasible. Aside from the obvious legal and physical reasons for this recommendation, aggressive tactics can lead to emotional turmoil, making it difficult to concentrate and think clearly about the threatening situation at hand. When we are emotionally aroused, and a good fight will do that, anyone who's experienced it knows this is true. It affects our ability to think effectively. This happens because our cognitive abilities are hijacked so that the limbic brain can have full use of all available cerebral resources. I'm going to repeat this. When we are emotionally aroused, and a good fight will do that, it affects our ability to think effectively. This happens because our cognitive abilities are hijacked so that the limbic brain can have full use of all available cerebral resources. Goldman, 1995, pages 27 and pages 204 through 207, 207. One of the best reasons for studying nonverbal behaviors is that they can sometimes warn you when a person intends to harm you physically, giving you time to avoid a potential conflict. An example that I can use is consider a computer program. Maybe it's an older program, but it requires loading multiple CDs. That time it takes to do all of that loading and perhaps even to operate, because of its size, it is similar to the limbic system in that it's using all of the CPU's processing ability to perform its function. So too do your emotions hijack your critical thinking ability and to see anything outside of that emotional status that you're in. All right, this one's going to run a little shorter because we have the next cutoff here, which will bring us into comfort, discomfort, and pacifiers.